The yellow school bus shuddered to a halt as two police cruisers blocked its path, their red and blue lights painting the autumn morning in harsh, alternating colors. Through the scratched windows, 8-year-old Marcus Williams pressed his face against the cool glass, his small hands fluttering in the rhythmic pattern that helped him process the overwhelming sensation of sirens piercing the air. The other children on Bus 47 fell silent, their usual chatter replaced by the collective held breath of witnesses about to see something terrible unfold. Officer Daniel Rodriguez approached the bus door with heavy steps, his radio crackling with dispatch codes that meant nothing to the terrified children inside. Behind him, his partner Sarah Chen checked her body camera, a routine gesture that would later prove crucial in ways neither officer could imagine. The bus driver, Karen Mitchell, stood beside the door with her arms crossed, her face set in the self-righteous mask of someone who believed she was saving the day. "He's been making those sounds for 20 minutes, Karen declared, her voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. Dangerous, disruptive noises. The other children are scared." Marcus had been riding Bus 47 for 3 years, ever since his family moved to Riverside Elementary's district. Every morning at 7:15 a.m., he would wait at the corner of Maple and 3rd Street, his blue backpack perfectly arranged on his shoulders, his lunchbox held in both hands because the weight distribution felt right. His mother, Dr. Elena Williams, would kiss his forehead and remind him to use his words if he felt overwhelmed. His father, James, would ruffle his hair and tell him to have a good day at school, just like any other parent sending their child off to learn and grow. The routine was Marcus's anchor in a world that often felt too bright, too loud, too much. He knew exactly where to sit 3rd row, left side, where he could see the driver, but not be overwhelmed by the chaos behind him. He knew that Mrs. Patterson, the regular driver, would greet him with a gentle smile and ask about his current favorite book. He knew that the 17-minute ride to school would begin with residential streets, transition to the main thoroughfare, and end with the familiar sight of the red brick building that housed his 2nd-grade classroom. But Mrs. Patterson had called in sick 3 days ago, and Karen Mitchell had taken over the route with the confidence of someone who believed children should be seen and not heard, regardless of their neurological differences. On the first day, Marcus had tried to explain his routine, his need for the same seat, his sensitivity to sudden sounds. Karen had listened with the patience of someone counting seconds until she could speak. "Rules are rules," she had said, pointing to a sign that read, "Driver reserves the right to assign seating. You'll sit wherever I tell you to sit." Marcus had managed the first day by humming quietly to himself, a self-soothing technique his occupational therapist had taught him. The humming helped organize his sensory input, creating a predictable sound pattern that his nervous system could latch onto when everything else felt chaotic. By the 2nd day, Karen had made it clear that humming was not acceptable behavior. "This is a school bus, not a concert hall," she had announced to the entire bus, her eyes fixed on Marcus in the rearview mirror. "Some people need to learn appropriate behavior." The 3rd day this morning had started like any other. Marcus had eaten his breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast cut into triangles, brushed his teeth for exactly 2 minutes, and checked his backpack 3 times to ensure his sensory tools were packed. His weighted lap pad, his noise-canceling headphones, his fidget cube, and his communication cards were all in their designated pockets. Dr. Williams had sent a detailed letter to the school district explaining Marcus's autism diagnosis, his sensory needs, and his coping strategies. But somehow, that information had never made it to the substitute bus driver. As Bus 47 navigated the morning traffic, Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that signaled sensory overload building. A kindergartner behind him was crying about a forgotten lunch, Two fifth graders were arguing over a trading card. The bus's brakes squealed at every stop, and the diesel engine created a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through Marcus's bones. He reached for his headphones, but Karen's voice cut through the noise like a knife. "No headphones on my bus. You need to hear safety instructions." Marcus tried to explain, his words coming out in the careful, precise way he had learned to speak when everything felt overwhelming. "My mom says I can use them when the sounds get too much. They help me stay calm." "Your mom's not driving this bus. Put them away." The sensory overload hit Marcus like a wave, and he began to rock gently in his seat, a movement so subtle that most people wouldn't notice. But Karen Mitchell noticed everything, and she interpreted Marcus's self-regulation as defiance. When he began to make the soft humming sound that helped him organize his overwhelmed nervous system, she saw it as deliberate disruption. "That's enough!" Karen's voice boomed through the bus, causing several children to jump. "I've warned you about making those weird noises. This is my final warning." Marcus tried to stop, but his nervous system was beyond his conscious control. The humming wasn't a choice. It was an automatic response to overwhelming sensory input, like breathing or blinking. When he couldn't make it stop, when the sound continued to escape, despite his desperate attempts to contain it, Karen made the decision that would change everything. She pulled the bus over at the next intersection, grabbed her radio, and called 911. "This is Bus 47. I need police assistance immediately. I have a child making dangerous noises, disrupting the safety of my vehicle. He's being aggressive and won't follow instructions. I need him removed before someone gets hurt." The word aggressive would haunt the police report, painting Marcus as a threat rather than a scared child trying to cope with overwhelming sensory input. Karen's description of dangerous noises would be repeated in official documents, transforming stimming behaviors into criminal activity. The phrase "won't follow instructions" would become evidence of defiance rather than neurological differences. Within minutes, the police cruisers arrived, their sirens adding to the sensory chaos that had already pushed Marcus past his breaking point. The other children on the bus watched in horror as Officer Rodriguez boarded the bus, his uniform and equipment creating an imposing figure in the narrow aisle. Marcus had curled into himself, his arms wrapped around his knees, his humming now accompanied by the gentle rocking that helped him process trauma. "Son, you need to come with us," Officer Rodriguez said, his voice not unkind, but carrying the authority of someone who expected immediate compliance. Marcus looked up with wide, frightened eyes, his ability to speak completely overwhelmed by the stress of the situation. He tried to reach for his communication cards, but his hands were shaking too much to manipulate the small, laminated squares. His silence was interpreted as defiance, his inability to move as resistance. "He's been disrupting the bus all morning," Karen provided helpfully, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who believed justice was being served. "Making those sounds, rocking back and forth, making the other children uncomfortable. I've asked him to stop multiple times, but he just ignores me." Officer Chen, who had remained by the bus door, noticed something that her partner had missed. Marcus wasn't looking at them with the calculating defiance of a child choosing bad behavior. His eyes held the unmistakable look of a trapped animal, pupils dilated with fear, his breathing rapid and shallow. She had seen this look before, in her nephew who had autism, during moments of overwhelming stress. "Rodriguez, wait!" she called out, but her partner was already reaching for Marcus, following protocol for removing a disruptive passenger. The moment Officer Rodriguez touched Marcus's shoulder, the boy's nervous system went into complete shutdown. He began to scream not the manipulative tantrum of a defiant child, but the raw, primal sound of terror. His body went rigid, then began to shake uncontrollably. Tears streamed down his face as he tried to make himself smaller, to disappear into the worn bus seat. The other children on the bus began to cry. 7-year-old Emma Rodriguez, who sat in the seat across from Marcus every day, stood up despite the chaos and shouted with the fierce protectiveness of a child who understood kindness better than the adults around her. "He's not bad. He's just scared. He always makes those sounds when he's scared." But her voice was lost in the commotion as Officer Rodriguez, following his training for dealing with uncooperative subjects, began to physically remove Marcus from the bus. The boy's screams intensified. His body went completely limp, and he began to shake so violently that Officer Chen finally stepped forward. "Daniel, stop. This isn't right." But it was too late. Marcus was already being carried from the bus, his small body racked with sobs, his blue backpack left behind on the seat like evidence of a childhood interrupted. The other children pressed their faces to the windows, watching in horror as their classmate was placed in the back of a police cruiser, his cries audible even through the closed windows. Karen Mitchell stood beside the bus with her arms crossed, her face set in the satisfied expression of someone who believed she had done the right thing. She had maintained order. She had protected the other children. She had followed proper procedures when faced with a disruptive student. "Thank you, officers," she said, her voice carrying the tone of someone who expected gratitude. "I knew he was going to be trouble from the first day. Some children just aren't ready for mainstream education." Officer Chen looked at Karen with growing unease, her training as a police officer warring with her instincts as a human being. Something about this situation felt fundamentally wrong. But the call had been made, the child had been removed, and the bus could continue its route to school. The remaining children on Bus 47 were silent for the rest of the ride, their usual chatter replaced by the collective trauma of witnessing injustice. They had seen one of their own treated like a criminal for behaviors they recognized as normal for Marcus. They had watched adults fail to protect someone who needed protection. They had learned a lesson about the world that no 8-year-old should have to learn. At Riverside Elementary, the other children filed off the bus with unusual quiet. Their teacher, Mrs. Henderson, immediately noticing something was wrong. When she asked about Marcus, the children's answers came in a torrent of confusion and fear. The police took him away. "He was just making his sounds." Mrs. Karen said he was dangerous. "He was crying so hard." Mrs. Henderson felt her stomach drop as she processed the children's words. She had taught Marcus for 4 months, had worked closely with his parents to create a supportive classroom environment, had seen him thrive when given the right accommodations. She knew his humming, his rocking, his need for routine. She knew he was a gentle, intelligent child who processed the world differently than his peers. She immediately called the main office, her voice shaking with barely controlled anger. "This is Sarah Henderson. I need to speak with Principal Martinez immediately. One of my students has been removed from the bus by police, and I think there's been a terrible mistake." Meanwhile, in the police station, Marcus sat in a small holding room designed for juvenile processing, his body still shaking from the traumatic experience. Officer Chen had managed to retrieve his backpack from the bus, and she quietly placed his weighted lap pad across his legs, hoping it might provide some comfort. The gesture was small, but significant, the first sign that someone in authority recognized Marcus as a child in need, rather than a threat to be contained. The police had called Marcus's parents, but Dr. Elena Williams was in surgery and couldn't be reached immediately. James Williams, a software engineer, had rushed from his office the moment he received the call, his mind reeling with confusion and fear. How had his son gone from riding the bus to school to being processed by the police? When James arrived at the station, he found his son curled in a corner of the holding room, his body still racked with periodic sobs. Marcus looked up when he heard his father's voice, his eyes swollen from crying, his small face marked with the exhaustion that comes from prolonged stress. "Daddy." Marcus's voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from crying. James gathered his son into his arms, feeling the tremor that still ran through the boy's small body. "I'm here, buddy. I'm here. You're safe now." Officer Chen approached them with obvious discomfort. Her earlier unease now crystallized into certainty that something had gone terribly wrong. "Mr. Williams, I need to tell you that I don't think this situation was handled correctly. Your son wasn't aggressive or dangerous. He was clearly distressed, and I believe he may have special needs that weren't communicated to us." James looked up at her with a mixture of gratitude and anger. Marcus has autism. He's never been aggressive a day in his life. He was stimming self-regulating because he was overwhelmed. The school district has all his documentation. The words hit Officer Chen like a physical blow. She had participated in the traumatic removal of a disabled child whose only crime was having a neurological difference. She had helped criminalize behaviors that were not only harmless, but necessary for Marcus's emotional regulation. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I tried to stop it, but it happened so fast." At the school district office, an emergency meeting was being called as news of the incident spread through the administration. Principal Martinez had immediately pulled Marcus's file, her face growing pale as she read the detailed documentation of his autism diagnosis, his sensory needs, and his successful accommodations in the classroom. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the district's special education director, felt sick as she reviewed the paperwork. Marcus's IEP clearly outlined his need for sensory supports, his communication differences, and his tendency to stim when overwhelmed. The documentation had been sent to the transportation department, but somehow it had never made it to the substitute drivers. "How did this happen?" Principal Martinez asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. "How did we fail to protect one of our most vulnerable students?" Mrs. Henderson, who had been called to the emergency meeting, provided the perspective of someone who knew Marcus personally. "He's one of the sweetest children I've ever taught. He's never been disruptive, never been aggressive. He just processes the world differently. When he hums or rocks, it's because he's trying to stay regulated. It's not defiance, it's self-care." The meeting was interrupted by a knock on the door. James Williams entered, his face a mask of controlled fury, his son's hand held tightly in his own. Marcus stayed close to his father, his eyes wide and wary, as he took in the room full of adults who had failed to protect him. "I want to know exactly how my son ended up being treated like a criminal for having autism," James said, his voice deadly quiet. "I want to know how trained professionals could mistake stimming for aggression, how a child's disability could be criminalized, how the systems designed to support him could fail so catastrophically." Principal Martinez stood up, her face flushed with shame and anger. "Mr. Williams, I cannot express how deeply sorry I am. This should never have happened. We have failed Marcus and your family in the most fundamental way possible." Dr. Walsh stepped forward, her voice shaking with emotion. "We have all of Marcus's documentation. His IEP is clear about his needs and his behaviors. There is no excuse for what happened this morning." Marcus pressed closer to his father, his small voice cutting through the adult conversation. "Am I in trouble? Daddy!" The question hung in the air like an accusation. The innocent words of a child who had been made to feel like a criminal for the way his brain worked. James knelt down to his son's level, his hands gentle on the boy's shoulders. "No, buddy. You're not in trouble. You didn't do anything wrong. The grown-ups made a mistake, and we're going to make sure it doesn't happen again." But even as James spoke the words, he knew the damage had been done. Marcus had learned that the world could be cruel to people who were different, that the systems designed to protect him could turn against him without warning. The trauma of being forcibly removed from the bus, of being treated like a threat, would stay with him long after the administrative responses were complete. The meeting continued for 2 hours, with district administrators scrambling to understand how such a massive failure of communication and training had occurred. Karen Mitchell was immediately suspended pending investigation, but the damage to Marcus and his family felt irreversible. Dr. Elena Williams arrived at the school directly from the hospital, still wearing her surgical scrubs, her face pale with exhaustion and fury. She had spent the drive from the hospital processing the phone call that had shattered her day, trying to understand how her son had gone from routine bus ride to police custody. "Where is he?" she demanded as she entered the conference room, her eyes immediately finding Marcus, who ran to her with the desperate relief of a child who had been waiting for his mother to make everything right. Elena gathered her son into her arms, her medical training immediately assessing him for signs of trauma. His breathing was still elevated, his body tense with residual stress, his eyes holding the hollow look of a child who had been forced to confront the world's capacity for cruelty. "What have you done to my baby?" she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. The question was directed at everyone and no one. A mother's cry of anguish at a system that had failed her child. Dr. Williams had dedicated her life to healing, to making people better, to using her skills to protect the vulnerable. Seeing her own son traumatized by the very systems meant to support him felt like a betrayal of everything she believed about society's capacity for good. Principal Martinez tried to explain the breakdown in communication, the failure to inform substitute drivers about students with special needs, the lack of training that had led to Marcus's behaviors being misinterpreted. But Elena Williams wasn't interested in explanation, she wanted accountability. "My son was traumatized by your employee," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who would not be dismissed. "He was treated like a criminal for having autism. Do you understand what that does to a child's sense of safety in the world?" The room fell silent as the weight of her words settled over the administrators. They were dealing with more than a policy failure or a communication breakdown. They were dealing with trauma inflicted on a vulnerable child by the very people entrusted with his care. As news of the incident began to spread through the community, the response was swift and overwhelming. Other parents of children with disabilities came forward with their own stories of discrimination and misunderstanding. Teachers who had worked with Marcus spoke out about his gentle nature and the injustice of his treatment. The local autism support group organized an emergency meeting to discuss the broader implications of what had happened. Sarah Martinez, the mother of a child with ADHD, was one of the first to speak publicly about the incident. "This could have been any of our children," she said at the hastily organized community meeting. "The criminalization of disability is something we cannot tolerate in our schools." The meeting, held in the elementary school gymnasium, drew over 300 people, parents, teachers, community members, and advocates for disability rights. The energy in the room was electric with anger and determination, the collective voice of a community that had witnessed injustice and refused to remain silent. Dr. Robert Chen, a local pediatrician who specialized in autism, stood up to address the crowd. "What happened to Marcus Williams is not an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a larger problem, the failure to understand and accommodate neurological differences in our schools and communities. As Dr. Chen spoke, he outlined the broader context of disability discrimination, the history of misunderstanding autism, and the critical need for better training and awareness. His words resonated with the crowd, many of whom had their own experiences with systems that failed to understand their children's needs. But it was Marcus himself who provided the most powerful testimony. With his father's help, he stood up in front of the crowd, his small voice amplified by the microphone that had been lowered to his height. "I wasn't being bad," he said, his words clear and precise despite his nervousness. "I was just trying to feel better. The sounds help me when everything is too much." The gymnasium fell completely silent as Marcus spoke, his innocence and vulnerability cutting through the complex adult discussions of policy and procedure. Here was a child trying to explain his disability to a world that had punished him for it, and his simple words carried more weight than any administrative response. "I like school," Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "I like my friends. I just need help sometimes when the world gets too loud." The crowd's response was immediate and overwhelming. Parents wiped away tears. Teachers nodded in recognition. And even the most hardened community members felt their hearts break for this brave little boy who had been forced to advocate for himself at such a young age. The local media had begun covering the story, and, by evening, Marcus's experience had been picked up by regional news outlets. The image of a sobbing 8-year-old being removed from a school bus by police officers became a powerful symbol of systemic failure and the need for change. Reporter Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7 News interviewed the Williams family in their living room, her camera capturing the quiet dignity of parents fighting for their child's rights. Dr. Williams sat with Marcus on her lap, his weighted blanket providing comfort as he processed the overwhelming attention. "We're not looking for sympathy," Dr. Williams said to the camera. "We're looking for change. We want to make sure this never happens to another child." The interview aired during the evening news, and the response was immediate and powerful. The station's phone lines lit up with calls from parents sharing their own stories, from teachers expressing outrage, from community members demanding action. Social media exploded with "Nair Justice for Marcus" hashtags and posts, sharing the story with growing outrage. Parents across the country recognized their own children's experiences in Marcus's story, and the incident became a rallying point for the broader disability rights movement. Dr. Temple Grandin, the renowned autism advocate, shared the story on her social media platforms with a statement that went viral. "This is exactly why we need better understanding of autism in our schools. Stimming is not aggression, it's self-regulation. This child was punished for having a neurological difference." The pressure on the school district intensified as the story gained national attention. District Superintendent Dr. Patricia Morrison called an emergency board meeting, knowing that the community's trust had been shattered and that meaningful change would be required to rebuild it. The school board meeting was packed beyond capacity, with hundreds of community members demanding answers and action. The board chambers, designed for routine discussions of budgets and policies, had been transformed into a venue for public accountability. Karen Mitchell, the bus driver whose call had started the entire incident, was conspicuously absent from the meeting. Her union representative read a brief statement expressing regret for the misunderstanding, but stopped short of taking full responsibility for what had happened. The statement only inflamed the crowd further. "Misunderstanding," shouted one parent. "Calling police on a disabled child is not a misunderstanding. It's discrimination." Board member Lisa Thompson, herself the mother of a child with autism, struggled to maintain her composure as she addressed the crowd. "We have failed one of our most vulnerable students. We have failed his family. We have failed our community. And we must do better." The meeting continued late into the night, with speaker after speaker sharing their experiences and demanding systemic change. Teachers talked about the need for better training and resources. Parents shared their fears about sending their children to school in a system that had proven capable of such cruelty. Students, including some of Marcus's classmates, spoke about the trauma of witnessing their friend's treatment. 10-year-old Emma Rodriguez, who had defended Marcus on the bus, stood up with her mother's help to address the board. "Marcus is my friend," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "He's not scary. He's not bad. He just needs help sometimes. Like when I need help with math." Her simple analogy comparing Marcus's need for sensory support to academic support resonated powerfully with the crowd. If the community could understand that some children needed extra help with reading or math, why couldn't they understand that some children needed extra help with sensory processing? As the meeting progressed, the board began to outline their response to the crisis. Karen Mitchell would be terminated immediately, pending the completion of her disciplinary hearing. All bus drivers would receive mandatory training on disability awareness and de-escalation techniques. The district would review all policies related to special needs transportation to ensure proper communication and support. But the community wanted more than reactive measures. They wanted proactive change that would prevent future incidents. Parent advocate Maria Santos stood up to address the board with a comprehensive list of demands that had been developed by the Disability Rights Coalition that had formed in response to Marcus's treatment. "We demand immediate implementation of comprehensive autism and disability awareness training for all staff," she began, her voice carrying the authority of organized advocacy. "We demand better communication systems to ensure that all staff working with special needs students have access to their accommodation plans. We demand accountability measures to prevent discrimination and ensure that incidents like this are immediately reported and addressed." The list continued with specific policy changes, budget allocations for training and support, and oversight mechanisms to ensure compliance. It was clear that the community had moved beyond anger to organized action, creating a framework for systemic change that would extend far beyond Marcus's individual case. Superintendent Morrison accepted the demands, recognizing that the district had no choice but to embrace comprehensive reform. "We will implement every one of these recommendations," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that the community's trust hung in the balance. The meeting ended with a commitment to establish a disability rights task force that would include parents, teachers, students, and community advocates. The task force would have the authority to review policies, recommend changes, and ensure that the district's response to Marcus's case resulted in lasting reform rather than temporary gestures. In the days following the board meeting, the district moved quickly to implement changes. Karen Mitchell was officially terminated, with the district citing her failure to follow proper procedures and her discrimination against a student with disabilities. The termination sent a clear message that discriminatory behavior would not be tolerated. All transportation staff received immediate training on autism awareness, de-escalation techniques, and proper procedures for working with students with disabilities. The training was developed in partnership with local autism organizations and parents of special needs students, ensuring that it addressed real-world situations rather than theoretical concepts. Mrs. Patterson, the regular bus driver who had been out sick, returned to work with a new understanding of her role in supporting students like Marcus. She met with the Williams family to express her regret about what had happened and to discuss how she could better support Marcus when he returned to riding the bus. "I've been driving school buses for 15 years," she told Dr. Williams during their meeting. "I thought I understood my job, but I realize now that I need to learn so much more about supporting all my students, especially those with special needs." The conversation was healing for both women, Mrs. Patterson's genuine remorse and commitment to growth, and Dr. Williams's recognition that not all school staff had failed Marcus. There were people in the system who cared deeply about doing right by all students. The district also implemented new communication protocols to ensure that all staff working with special needs students had access to their accommodation plans. A secure digital system was created that allowed teachers, bus drivers, support staff, and administrators to access relevant information about students' needs and successful strategies. Marcus's story had also sparked conversations about police training and response to incidents involving individuals with disabilities. Officer Chen had become an advocate for change within the police department, sharing her experience and pushing for better training on recognizing and responding to autism-related behaviors. "We need to understand that what looks like defiance or aggression might actually be a disability-related behavior," she told her colleagues during a training session. "We need to slow down, ask questions, and consider alternative explanations before we assume someone is being uncooperative." The police department partnered with local autism organizations to develop new protocols for responding to incidents involving individuals with disabilities. Officers received training on recognizing autism-related behaviors, de-escalation techniques, and the importance of family involvement in crisis situations. As the weeks passed, Marcus slowly began to heal from the trauma of his experience. With the support of a therapist who specialized in working with children with autism, he processed his feelings about what had happened and began to rebuild his sense of safety in the world. The therapy sessions were difficult, with Marcus struggling to understand why he had been treated so harshly for behaviors that were natural to him. But with time and support, he began to understand that the problem wasn't with him, it was with systems that didn't understand or accommodate his differences. "I'm not bad for being different," he told his therapist during one session, his words reflecting the growth that had come from processing his trauma. "Some grown-ups just don't understand autism yet." His return to school was carefully planned, with additional supports in place to help him feel safe and successful. His teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had worked with his parents to create a sensory-friendly environment in the classroom, with quiet spaces available when he needed to self-regulate. The other students in his class had also been supported in processing what they had witnessed. The school brought in specialists to help the children understand autism and to process their own feelings about seeing their classmate treated unfairly. Emma Rodriguez, who had defended Marcus on the bus, became one of his strongest advocates in the classroom. She helped other students understand his needs and celebrated his successes with the fierce loyalty of a true friend. "Marcus is really smart," she told new students who joined their class. "He just shows it in different ways. And his humming is actually really nice. It means he's taking care of himself." The incident had also strengthened the broader autism community, with parents and advocates organizing regular support meetings and educational events. The trauma of Marcus's experience had catalyzed a movement for better understanding and support of individuals with autism throughout the community. Dr. Williams had become a powerful advocate for autism awareness, speaking at conferences and workshops about the importance of understanding and accommodating neurological differences. Her medical background gave her credibility, but her experience as Marcus's mother gave her passion. "Autism is not a behavior problem," she would tell audiences. It's a neurological difference that requires understanding and support. When we criminalize the symptoms of autism, we traumatize vulnerable children and fail as a society. The school district's response to Marcus's case became a model for other districts facing similar challenges. The comprehensive training programs, communication protocols, and oversight mechanisms that had been developed in response to his trauma were shared with educators across the state. 6 months after the incident, Marcus was thriving in school. His academic performance had improved with the additional supports, and his social connections had deepened as his classmates gained better understanding of his needs. The trauma of his experience remained, but it had been transformed into a catalyst for positive change. The anniversary of the incident was marked not with mourning, but with celebration of the progress that had been made. The community organized an autism awareness event, with Marcus and his family as honored guests. The event featured educational booths, sensory-friendly activities, and presentations about autism acceptance and inclusion. Marcus, now 9 years old and more confident in his advocacy, addressed the crowd with the support of his parents. His speech was brief but powerful, reflecting the growth that had come from turning trauma into purpose. "I want everyone to know that being different is okay," he said, his voice clear and strong. "I have autism, and that means my brain works differently. Sometimes I need to stim to feel better, and that's okay. I hope other kids like me never have to go through what I did." The crowd's response was overwhelming, with parents, teachers, and community members standing in appreciation of this brave young boy who had helped transform their understanding of autism and inclusion. Karen Mitchell, the bus driver whose actions had started the entire incident, had not found employment in education since her termination. The incident had followed her through background checks and reference calls, serving as a reminder of the consequences of discriminating against individuals with disabilities. She had eventually reached out to the Williams family through a mediator, expressing remorse for her actions and asking for forgiveness. The family had chosen not to meet with her, but they had sent a message through their attorney expressing hope that she would use the experience to become a better advocate for all children. The incident had also led to legislative changes at the state level, with new laws requiring disability awareness training for all school personnel and strengthening protections for students with special needs. Marcus's story had become a powerful example of how individual trauma could be transformed into systemic change. As Marcus entered 4th grade, he continued to use his voice to advocate for autism, awareness, and acceptance. He had started a friendship club at school that paired neurotypical students with students who had disabilities, creating connections that fostered understanding and inclusion. His parents watched with pride as their son, who had once been traumatized by the world's lack of understanding, became a leader in creating a more inclusive community. The little boy who had been criminalized for stimming was now teaching others about the importance of neurodiversity and acceptance. The story of Marcus Williams had become more than an account of injustice. It had become a testament to the power of community advocacy and the possibility of transforming trauma into positive change. The systems that had failed him had been rebuilt with his needs at the center, creating a safer and more inclusive environment for all students. On a quiet Tuesday morning, almost 2 years after the incident, Marcus climbed aboard Bus 47 with his blue backpack and his weighted lap pad, ready for another day of learning and growth. "Mrs. Patterson greeted him with a warm smile and asked about his current favorite book, just as she had before the incident that changed everything. But something fundamental had shifted in the weeks and months following that traumatic morning. The bus was no longer just a vehicle for transporting students. It had become a space where differences were understood and accommodated. where children like Marcus could be themselves without fear of punishment or discrimination. As the bus pulled away from the curb, Marcus settled into his familiar seat and began to hum softly to himself. The sound no longer a source of controversy, but a recognized expression of his unique way of processing the world. The other children on the bus had learned to appreciate the gentle rhythm of his self-regulation, and some had even asked to learn his techniques for managing overwhelming sensory input. The transformation was complete, but the vigilance continued. The community had learned that protecting vulnerable individuals required constant attention and advocacy, that systems could fail without warning, and that the price of inclusion was eternal vigilance. Marcus Williams had taught his community that autism was not a disorder to be cured, but a difference to be understood and supported. His trauma had become their catalyst for change, his vulnerability, their strength, his voice, their inspiration for creating a world where all children could thrive, regardless of how their brains worked. The noise that had once shattered a community, the sound of a frightened child being criminalized for his disability, had been replaced by the powerful chorus of voices advocating for understanding, acceptance, and inclusion. And in that transformation, Marcus Williams had found not just healing for himself, but hope for every child who would come after him. The yellow school bus continued its route through the community, carrying children to a place of learning that had been forever changed by one small boy's courage to be himself in a world that had initially punished him for it. The lesson learned was profound, that true strength comes not from conformity, but from the courage to create spaces where every child can flourish exactly as they are.